Okay, we're gonna get started. So welcome everyone here in person and all of you in cyberspace to the launch of The Short While by Jeremy Sorese. Yes, give it up, give it up. My name is Greg. My partner is Donnie Jokum, and we are the co-founders of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, which is the very space you find yourselves. The Bureau, we like to say, is a government agency for a government that does not yet exist. And the service we provide is holding this space for queer books and queer culture. So thanks for coming out tonight. Thanks for everyone who donated online. We do have a suggested donation of $10, and I'm going to pass the bag around. There's change in here. But if money is tight and you would like to buy the book, you should definitely hold on to your money and buy the book. Or other books, many books. I'll pass that around. And we are happily doing lots of in-person events again, as well as some live streaming. And if you'd like to find out about those, you can sign up for our email list. You'll get an email every other week about our upcoming events. So I'm going to introduce Jeremy and Lale, and then we're going to get started. So after graduating from Savannah College of Art and Design in 2010, Jeremy Sorese was accepted to La Maison des Auteurs, a residency program in Angoulême, France, where he worked from 2012 through 2013. His first book, Curveball, published with No Brow in 2015, was nominated for a Lambda Literary Award. A sequel, Short While, was published with Archaea in November 2021. He's been teaching art for 11 years, elementary school children in Chicago, middle schoolers in Brooklyn, college students at the Maryland Institute College of Art, and most recently at the New School, School of Visual Arts, and the Animation Workshop in Viborg, Denmark. And Lale, who will be joining Jeremy in conversation after the presentation, is a cartoonist and animator. Her work has been published in magazines and anthologies such as Framers, Ergo, sure, Best American Comics, Bomb Magazine, The Lifted Brow, Strapazin, and Lagon Revue. Her animation work has shown internationally at festivals, galleries, and the New Museum in New York City. Her music video for Lightning Bolt's Metal East won an, is that right, Metal East? Yeah. Won an award at Leeds International Film Festival in 2015. Lale was lucky enough to be a guest artist and lecturer at comics residencies in France, Germany, and Russia in 2019. Lale Westvind has a passion for motorcycles, movement, and working with her hands. She currently teaches at Parsons School of Design in New York City. Please welcome them both, and we'll get started. Right. Technology's working.
Hello, everybody. I just wanted to take a moment to thank you all for coming out. It means the absolute world to me, and I'm going to keep that part short because I feel like I can go very rambly very quickly. So I just want to take a moment and thank you all. It means a lot to me. For those that are not familiar, I'm going to be starting off tonight with a short reading from the beginning of my new book, The Short While, followed by a conversation with Lale, and then we'll do sort of a question and answer, and followed by some signing opportunity for those that want to buy a book or have a book with them already. Sound like a plan? All right. So to start off, I'm going to be reading a chapter from The Short While. It's a pseudo sequel to my first book, Curveball, which came out in 2015. Short While is also science fiction, kind of half comics, half prose hybrid. To clarify what that means, most of the pages of the book look like this, or this, or are sometimes just a regular page of comics. Short While is about two men, Paolo and Colin, who accidentally leave a party wearing each other's nearly identical leather jackets. And then after they swap them back, they go on a date. They see a movie that Paolo unexpectedly starts crying in the middle of, and they decide to leave early. I'm so embarrassed. Don't be. I'm the one who feels bad. Everything's 4D now, and this one wasn't, and I can't believe you've already seen me cry. How attractive can that possibly be? Over drinks, they tell one another a story of their lives. They talk about Colin's job, who works for a project manager for an advisory committee regarding public monuments. After the fall of the previous government, colloquially referred to as the administration, Colin's team is now in charge of replacing monuments built in reverence for that more authoritarian government with more gentle contemporary works to help increase tourism. How he was raised by a single mother named Minnie, who had him by way of a donor. How she is a member of the dance, a self-help pseudo-religion who work together in troops doing community outreach, started by a group of friends who would originally meet after work on evenings when their schedules permitted to spin in open fields and make out as a way to alleviate stress. They talk about Paolo's life, who works a series of odd jobs, including, but not limited to, landscaper, plotline writer for erotic virtual reality experiences, barista at an organic beetle bar, as well as volunteering at his local animal shelter. How Paolo was the third child of 2 immigrants from the EU who accidentally and reluctantly had him much later in life. There's a 15-year age gap between Paolo and his older siblings, Caroline and Carolina, which meant Paolo's childhood was spent isolated and alone. Caroline and Carolina work as data analysts, specializing in dismantling the large surveillance network created by the administration. Shortly after being hired, his sisters were promoted, and in their new positions, ordered to maintain and reinstate this network for the current government. His sisters have 2 boys each, Corey and Corin and Carl. Both women are now divorced. Paolo talks about how the language and cultural barrier he felt growing up with too much older parents caused him to shrink in his ambition. He flitted between jobs, easily distracted from obtainable goals by loftier, more abstract ones. Because he knew he could never measure up to the expectations of his parents, he felt free to do whatever he wanted, but didn't know what that would be. He made his own way, often by accident. He couldn't remember how he'd made any of his friends in the city. When those friends invited him to a party thrown by someone one of them had once worked with on a dinner cruise, he agreed to attend without much thought. He wore a leather jacket, even though it was still a little too warm to wear comfortably in early December. He liked the jacket, picked out of a box of free clothes left behind in the lobby of someone he had once hooked up with. Paolo was disappointed in himself for not saying anything to Colin while they were both at the party. They even waited in the same line for the bathroom. Having felt invisible most of his life, Paolo thought of himself as impervious to embarrassment. Shyness was simply not him. And yet, despite his easygoing nature, something in Colin made him feel like he needed reassurance before stepping outside the safety of himself. Colin didn't think of himself as inaccessible, but he knew he could be reserved. Not like the moon in its cold distance, but the sun, the bright spot that keeps everyone tethered to it. Long after the relationship had come and gone, Paolo would always recall how this boyfriend had made him a little nervous at first. After years of feeling neglected, Colin seemed to Paolo like an impossible grand prize, a tall, handsome trophy of a man who couldn't possibly have been for Paolo's to keep. So, do you wanna, only if you want to. I mean, if you want to, then yeah. You good? I have a little sugar and these little tarts, blackberry and currant. I can't believe they've already made a documentary about the executions. Colin realized Paolo wanted to talk about the documentary they had tried to watch the night before, the one Paolo had wept through. The documentary, A View from All Sides, follows the history of ARGOs, also known as aeronautic relay gyroscopes, and the various ways in which they've been implemented in the past 60 years. Designed by a man named Orville Obersteiner, the ARGOs were first used to relay information to the farthest reaches of rapidly expanding city centers. Outdated infrastructure made most telecommunications an expensive and rare commodity, leaving large urban and suburban communities isolated. Local broadcasting stations without the budget to upkeep their own equipment could rent an ARGO instead. Some were rented by neighborhoods to watch sporting events together, which helped defray the cost. Occasionally, they were used by local councils to remind their constituents of important information, such as when to vote in upcoming elections or where to get vaccinated. When the administration rose to power, ARGOs were quickly co-opted for their own purposes. Here at the Urban Community Museum, there are catalogs on display full of the unanswered requests submitted by the average citizens to rent an ARGO, each one ignored. When the ARGOs did return to circulation, the government privatized the entire fleet, making them unaffordable to the average citizen. At the time, no one knew what the administration planned to do with them. For months, the ARGOs drifted aimlessly, their dark screens looming ominously. Soon the administration began to use the ARGOs to televise executions in an effort to intimidate. Initially, the executions on display were recordings from long before the administration came into power, in an attempt to show they were more civilized than the predecessors. Inevitably, new executions began, projected for everyone to see as a warning. Often these executions were persons the administration deemed dangerous or uncooperative with their new vision of the world. Very little documentation of these individuals exists beyond the televised executions themselves. As a form of quiet resistance, a photo began circulating of an ARGO struck by lightning during an unexpected thunderstorm. Although the ARGO didn't crash, the image became synonymous with anyone hoping to overthrow their oppressors. It graced album covers, advertisements, clothing brands, anything that would show support for radical change. The administration moved quickly to crack down on use of the image, and it wasn't long before those seen openly flaunting their support began to disappear. Even after that, there were still numerous examples of this image hidden away in the linings of jackets, printed on the insides of books, even as a tattoo. After the fall of the administration, the ARGOs disappeared for a second time. Information was slow to circulate without well-supported news outlets, leaving many communities unaware of the shift in their government. The government that came to replace the administration was inundated with problems and lacked the resources to handle them properly. Despite their oppressive connotations, the ARGOs were once again seen as an opportunity to reunite the shattered communities they were now trying to serve. Many older people who lived through the administration were quick to speak out against their use, but despite these initial protests, the ARGOs were utilized to display simple information, like the 7-day weather forecast. Over time, they were expanded to include local events. Some communities allowed families to use them personally, having their local ARGO display a birthday greeting for a child or a slideshow of photos taken on their recent vacation. Unsurprisingly, their return to being used solely for public good was short-lived. Faced with the inability to broadcast news about the upcoming trials of key figures within the administration's cabinet, the new government decided to once again use the ARGOs to make examples of citizens seen as a threat to public safety. The backlash was swift and immediate, but the ARGOs stayed visible through each trial and subsequent sentencing. Some people were quick to recognize the poetic justice in condemning the administration's chief media strategist, Megan Johnson, on the very device she championed. Others lamented the ARGOs as a cruel manipulative tool, regardless of who was using them. The current government hoped for better transparency than the predecessors, but found themselves inevitably following in their footsteps. When the crimes committed were deemed to warrant an execution, the ARGOs once again served their purpose. Community organizers struggled to find a positive use for them that challenged this vicious history, continuing to run birth announcements and fun science facts for local children between passionate courtroom proceedings. But after nearly a year of preceding trials, their use in this way once again began to feel normal. The executions took place over 1 week, each day a different cabinet member. Everyone could agree that what was happening was horrific, but the crimes committed by the administration had already begun to fade, worn smooth and inconsequential by newer, more sensational horrors. This is what Colin and Paolo both remembered about that week. Not the specifics of who had died, but rather that people had died, hovering high up above their heads. Minnie kept Colin indoors that week, shut off from the final words of people she herself barely knew anything about. The administration was of her parents' generation, and besides, Colin's well-being was more important than bearing witness to history her parents hadn't survived long enough to see. Each day at 6 p.m., When that day's convict was led into the execution chamber, many would snip the energy converter in their apartment, which cut off not only the electricity, but all broadcasted images from flowing into their home. She made the week into a kind of game, eating dinner together by candlelight as if they were weathering some ferocious storm. Paolo, on the other hand, remembered those days as particularly awful ones. When stressed, his mother would scream without warning, sometimes ear-piercingly loud, other times barely a yelp. And the daily executions, slowed by all-day televised commentary, meant she started well before noon. His father would drink to offset his wife's outbursts, watching each person die as his wife tearfully begged for him to come inside. Avoiding his parents, Paolo was stuck waiting in his room until each execution was over, unable to escape by just leaving as he normally would. He would hide his telecommunicator in the closet, unable to shut off the live feed without cutting energy to the whole house. Even muffled under the dirty clothes in his closet, he could still hear each ragged, protracted breath. Even if he didn't know it at the time, it was in that moment of hearing Paolo describe that week of executions, of realizing Paolo had agreed to see that movie despite knowing it would be hard for him, that Colin decided he would do everything he could possibly do for Paolo, which is what he did until he couldn't anymore. Thank you. Yeah, inside the actor studio. All right. You can take your mask off too. Stay a while.
I will. I'm gonna...
So Lale and I will talk about the book. We have talked together, so we were thinking that in our conversation of us sort of talking about the book together, if you have questions in the moment, if you feel compelled to ask, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll incorporate them in the conversation. So don't feel any pressure to like wait until the very last moment to chime in or anything like that. So sound like a plan? All right.
Whoa. Whoa, okay, get my notes. I really enjoyed Jeremy's book so much. It's very rich with detail and layered, and there's so much nuance in it that is often lacking from current conversations and stories. That's like my favorite part about it. So first off, the title of the book, The Short While, where does it come from? What does that mean? I'm curious.
For my thinking was that I was trying to think of like what the opposite of something, like thinking about the phrase a long haul, being like I'm in it for the long haul with someone, be it a relationship or sort of a career or something like that, and sort of thinking about what the opposite of that would be. And in the book, there's so many people who are either experiencing maybe a short relationship, or they're experiencing a time in their life, or reflecting back on a time in their life that sort of was over more quickly than I think they maybe wanted it to be. And I was trying to think about those relationships that, you know, weren't part of my life for very long, but they were very formative, be it good or bad. And thinking about, I think there's often tropes within like queer media, especially sort of like cis queer media aimed for like in comics or aimed for younger people, where it's like the idea is that like a soulmate is the only goal, you know. It's like that first love is like so formative that you like are never able to see beyond it, you know. And I was trying to think of like what would be a way to tell a story that's kind of like the opposite of that, where it's like the whole goal is that all these relationships are shorter, that they're sort of like more complicated and less heteronormative than maybe I think most media that at least I see is reflected.
Cool. Also, I also thought maybe it was kind of sounds like description of the moment being this like moments are passing all the time, but there is this long expanse of them. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's like there's a little not oxymoron, but
No, yeah.
yeah.
Well, and there's also like
Contradiction.
one of my favorite like moments in all books of all, that's a weird thing to say. One of my favorite moments in a book ever is there's a there's a passage in To the Lighthouse, and I can't remember the name of the character. It's the mother character, but she's reflecting on this moment where there's basically a conversation happening in a living room, and the conversation's happening, everybody's talking, and she moves to the doorway to move to the next room and stands on the threshold and is aware that as soon as she moves to that threshold, that conversation for her will be over forever. And it's a thing that I think about all the time, because it is this thing that, like, to me is such a profoundly beautiful moment, and something that, to me, when I read it, it really just like, it knocked my socks off in a way that I just can't get over. And I think trying to think about life in that way, I think has been sort of nurturing for me, of just being like, these that you can't hold on to these things, and how do you sort of make peace with that, besides making 400-page books to try to like trap it all together, you know?
Did you tear up when you read it?
Yeah. You know, I mean, yeah. So that's a beautiful book. I highly recommend it.
Okay, moving on. So the use of light and darkness in the book seems purposeful. There are sections which maybe due to printing error, but I thought it was quite nice actually. There's moments in the book that are so dark it's almost hard to pick out what's happening, and they create kind of intense intimacy, sometimes vulnerability. So if you want to talk about was that intentional, or what were your thoughts on? There's a lot of like light, extreme light and extreme dark. Yeah.
Well, I think some of that I think came through, like when I made Curveball, a lot of the inspiration that went to that book was sort of these like black and white, romancy, like Hollywood, sort of like The Apartment, the Billy Wilder movie was really important for me at that time. And then other like sort of like noirish, like The Third Man, sort of these like really extreme areas of light and dark within the movies, and sort of wanting to sort of play with that with science fiction, which I think often sort of feels maybe like a car commercial, and being like, how do I sort of subvert that visually of like, we're so used to Star Wars, everything's exploding and everything's sort of like glossy and bright, and how do you sort of make it maybe a little bit more intimate in that way, or maybe a little bit more, shrink it down a little bit. And so I think some of that stylistic stuff carried over to The Short While as well. I think it's just how I think about these narratives and think about these stories, since they sort of occupy a similar world. And so with this one, you know, because it's pulling from horror movies or sort of these like horror tropes, I think the extreme black and extreme white, I think also felt appropriate, because of sort of playing with the like anxiety of the book, and sort of these ways in which, you know, like for example, there's a sort of intense scene in the middle of the book that happens in broad daylight. And it was important to me, I think, to sort of play with that expectation of what, as someone who's a scaredy cat and like is scared of all movies ever, I think there's such an easiness, it's such an ease to be like, well, scary things just happen at night, and trying to move that to be like, these things are kind of everything could be scary and also beautiful at the same time, and sort of like playing with that idea for myself as I was making the book.
I remember trying to leave room for questions
Oh,
or
yeah.
comments of this, but yeah.
I had a question.
Oh, yeah.
I'm curious about the fact that this book follows Curveball,
Mhm.
and in what ways I feel like there's more complexity in Short While.
Mhm.
But can you speak to like why did you decide to continue in the same world versus just having a whole new standalone?
Mhm. Well, no, I think that's a very good question. I think one thing that Curveball taught me, you know, because with these books, you're sort of like living in your own head for so long, and then 5 years later, you like have a product, and you have to like talk to other adults at a signing about these sort of like strange thoughts you've had in isolation. And I think Curveball to me, because it was like when I was younger and sort of working through like with Curveball, it was like I was really processing sort of like my first love in many ways, and so those feelings were very raw. And I was not prepared for the strangeness of people having different relationships to that book than I sort of intended. And I think the learning from that experience of sort of recognizing other people's reactions to it and sort of their own interpretations, and then sort of taking comics and trying to mush in narrative fiction at the same time to sort of create a scale that was maybe a little bit broader than Curveballs, where I was like more aware of the emotions of the characters, make that a little bit more transparent. And I think really getting to the space of like with Curveball, it was hard, I think, in many ways to sort of let go. And I think with this one, I was like, there's all these things in Curveball that I wanted to communicate that I don't know if I did, or even if I tried, I don't think it was maybe successful. And with this, really wanting to give myself a little bit of insurance to really make sure that like my hopes and dreams for these characters emotionally, there was never a question about like how they feel about a situation, and really letting myself, I think being older as well, really being like, these things the emotions that I'm putting into the story are complicated, and wanting to sort of like be okay with that complication rather than skimming them out to make it a little bit more streamlined. So, yes.
I was wondering, with this book, it was always so interesting to me, like the parts that you decided to show comics and the parts that were like prose and illustration, like very, very prose heavy. What did you have like a methodology with picking like which to go where, or was it just like what felt?
Well, the book sort of came about in a funny way, where sort of in the book, chapter 2 is sort of like all comics. And that originally was going to be its own separate book. So when I pitched this idea to Nobrow, my publisher of Curveball, I truly was like, went full like pitch packet, like I have an idea. And at the time, my idea was going to be a series of sort of like loosely connected short books. Approached Nobrow, and I was like, here's my idea. Here's like a written typeset treatment. And they were just like, we don't really know, but like maybe. And they're like, could you draw it? And I was like, sure. So I ended up just drawing it, thinking that that was going to be like enough to convince them. And then they were like, they weirdly admitted that they actually never read it, because I think they were trying to be very nice. They're very British. I think they just were trying to be very nice about the fact that like vaguely sexy home invasion story was maybe not their marketing plan. And so that sort of stayed as its own separate book. But then I think as it sort of developed, kind of like a barnacle, as it sort of grew, I liked that sort of true blue, almost like horror story within the middle of it stayed a comic, and then letting everything sort of reflect back on that incident in those characters' lives, and sort of use the rest of the book as a space to sort of explore why what happened and sort of how they felt about it afterwards. And I think it was, even in the beginning when it was still just a true blue comic, at the time what was this? This was 2015 into 2016. I feel like there was like a huge uptick of like murder mystery, podcasty media. And my brother, who I love dearly, is obsessed with murderers. Like he will read any book about a man who murdered another man. Like it truly is his bread and butter. And I, in a way to sort of connect with him, I was sort of invested in sort of like reading other things that, I'm a scaredy cat. I don't really want to read that stuff. But it was striking to me, for every story about someone who gets murdered at the end, there's inevitably another story about someone who like experiences something horrific and then still existed, who still like had a life and still moved on. And I think the book became a way for me to sort of like tell a story about something traumatic that happens to two characters, but it doesn't define them, and really be okay with sort of using the structure of the book to exemplify that feeling of like life continues regardless, and wanting to tell a story that didn't end with just being traumatic for the sake of being traumatic, but rather sort of reflected on that complicated feeling of being like, this thing has happened and yet I still am a person and still have to function, and in a way it became sort of telling about my own life in that process as well. So
this is great, because one of those questions I had about the process of writing the book, and so that's great. And then leading into this, although you already kind of said it, was that I was happy that the portion that Jeremy read, if you haven't read the book yet, describes the character Colin's job of redesigning these monuments. And there's also, you heard about the Argos, this technology which is still lingering, which has been used for horrible things. And then so that, for me, reading the book, that kind of set the tone actually of what you said, where the whole book is about traumatic events and how they affect people's relationship to each other, to objects, to places, and it happens other times throughout the book. There's other objects that some people are not okay with them being around because they remember what they were used for, and that's a real thing that happens. It's not just in Jeremy's book. So I feel like you spoke on that, but I'm curious about this. You were born in Berlin. And there is a section of wall, it's the southern border wall in the book, which is now on display as a memorial. And there's a memorial like that in Berlin. So do you want to speak on that connection there? That, how much was that?
Yeah.
I don't know how long.
No. I mean, it is a thing of like, because, I think that the wall, the wall bit towards the end, I think was a combo of the Berlin Wall, but also I think at the time when the book was sort of shifting to be this sort of like prose comics hybrid, it was like 2016, early 2017. And so it was like Trump election. I think the wall was very much something that was in conversation constantly. And I think even at the time, I think maybe because it was so intense, there was a part of me that I think wanted to talk about that sort of this like naive moment as being American of being like, I cannot believe this is happening. And also I think maybe recognizing the fact that these things are sort of weirdly universal, that there are sort of these like repeating moments in history where something like that happens. And you're just like, I think I was sort of trying to see the end before it came, but also I think trying to recognize the fact that it was just a bigger conversation in the United States that we were having because of Trump, but I think just is maybe the air we breathe in many ways that we weren't, especially as a white person, was not maybe as cognizant as I should have been. And so I think things like the wall, things like, the facilitators, things like that, it's sort of talking about using these things to try to talk about this like complicated baggage that history can sort of have. Like, for example, with facilitators, and for those that have not read the book, there's sort of these like male sex robots that have like a complicated history. And for me, it was this thing of wanting to talk about like this sort of trope within the gay community of sort of like muscle queens, right? And being like, I think when I was younger, it was very easy to be like, those like generic Instagram photos of like 8 identical men in Speedos, I think was sort of like felt really intense and sort of like something I didn't know how to process. And now that I'm older, I think I'm sort of recognizing that it's like everyone's going to see that group of people differently and sort of wanting to be okay with the fact that that is a complicated dynamic that is present with the gay community, that it's like whatever, like when I was younger, I think I was very bent out of shape about like overcooked bodies. And then now being like, it's going to be different for everybody, and that these moments of history have a complicated nature to them, and wanting to really talk about that complicated nature without trying to solve anything, being like a wall, even the Berlin Wall, like, my parents lived in Berlin for a decade. I was only there for maybe 6 months to 8 months, but, as a tiny infant. But my mom, for example, has very intense memories of the wall and Berlin being deeply depressing. Like every time we talk about it, she just is like, the sun never came out for a decade, as far as my mom was concerned. And as a kid, we had these big photo albums of their photos from Berlin. And my mom would always talk about being in the military base and hearing gunshots at night as people were trying to cross over from the east to the west. And it was this thing that, like, as a kid was so visceral to me, this idea of like the west side of the wall was graffitied, it was sort of beautiful and weird, and the right side was all white. And I think that memory of my mom talking about that being so traumatic for her, and me as a kid sort of reprocessing that, and having been to Berlin, and the new version of it is that it exists now. And I think so much of that sort of is in the book in its own way. You know?
Totally, very much so. Yeah, no, and that's what I love about the book. There's like multiple perspectives. There are these two main characters, but everyone kind of gets their moment, and the prose acts as like the prose isn't omniscient, and it gives us the like intentions and the thought process behind the other characters, which is something that's very compassionate, something we don't always get. And it feels generous on your part. and I had mentioned in writing these questions, this is the next thing, but that there are a couple characters who are these like older lesbians who like are man-hating and they're kind of turfy, and so it's a good call out to have in the book. And it's also I try to situate them in this larger thing, also thinking of them as like they're responding to their own kind of trauma in a way, but they don't get as much of a background as these other characters. If anything, they're like the bad guys a little bit.
Well, I think
which I appreciated.
Well, that was the thing, is that I think because like I think generous is such a good word for what I was hoping for, where, you know, I think dedicating space to someone in a story is essentially, it's not that I'm agreeing with everything that's part of that person's personality, but that I'm centering them in some way. And it was important to me that I sort of give everybody within reason dedicated space, because I think that is something that I crave in stories so much, that I sort of get to see. And it's something that's like why I think the story is the way it is that there's so many novels that have this sort of like spider webbing effect, but I don't necessarily always see that in comics. I think just because comics, it's harder to do that when you just have visuals. So I really wanted to tell a story that had that sort of sense of like a large community where you're sort of moving out into it over time. Even if it's like the same, even there's not more characters, it's just you get to know them a little bit more and the pieces fit together a little bit more closely. So with those characters, I think the ones that were turfy, I think my goal was to sort of have them be maybe flatter, to sort of like be kind of like these sort of like flat cartoon versions of what they could be. And, you know, I think this idea of like, what was I? I was thinking about this idea basically of like, with the turfy characters, when I was working on the book early on, have you ever been to the Lesbian History Archive in Park Slope? It's amazing. They had a book sale, and I bought this anthology called Women in Midlife from like Kitchen Sink Press in the 80s or something, but it was an essay collection about women, specifically lesbians at midlife. And it was a thing where I just sort of bought it on a whim, but I remember reading that book and being so struck by the wide range of essays from all these different women. And a lot of them were women who had been married to men and then had fallen in love with women later on in life. And these things that as a cis gay man, I had like never thought of, like, you know, women who had fallen in love with a woman, became very radicalized, and then had the complication of having a son. And then being like, I don't know, I don't feel comfortable bringing my son around to these like feminist events because no one really wants him there. And I feel guilty as a mom. And what does that look like? And I think that book stayed with me because it just was a way of seeing the world that I had never thought of before. And I think in those essays, what I was so captivated by was the fact that like, there was never a point where, you know, I think in contemporary fiction or contemporary sort of like online queerness, there's often sort of a seeking of solutions, of being like, well, how do we fix the problem? Like, how do we sort of like work out a universal idea that we all can agree on of like what this should look like? And that essay collection was like, you know, these women being like, I'm gonna bring my son around because I love him. We just have to have a conversation about it. And we're just gonna navigate this forever, the end. And I think that to me felt so exciting. And so much of that I think found its way into the book because of how fresh that felt, to be like, we're not going to fix it. We're going to keep hurting each other. It's just going to be the goal to sort of work that out over time. So
I like that you said flattening before. I think that's a cool, that is the effect that certain mindsets have. It's like, there's no more questioning and there's no more depth, and it's just flat right there. It's like,
and that was the thing too, it's like with the story, sort of you eventually realize in the world that, you know, I was very mindful of like making a story where I didn't want the villains to be straight people. Like I didn't want it to be like, that to me felt too easy, to be like, queer utopia is perfect, everybody else is bad. You know, so I was like, how do I then sort of take it where the villains, or essentially the negative people, the antagonists, are essentially people who have a narrowness to them. You know, it's like they've essentially made it so that they're right and everybody else is wrong. And that's kind of the antithesis of what the relationships in the book that function are like, where it's like these just are complicated forever and people hurting each other, and that's the reality of it, rather than being like, I'm fixing this for all time, you know?
I don't want questions or comments on that chunk. No. Personally, I wanted. Oh yeah. That it is a very. There are like these. There's different ages of characters, and they each have their own relation to what happened historically, and obviously they have their own relationship to queerness and to relationships, and that also is fascinating. And there's a lot of talk of family dynamics and how parents relate to their children and vice versa. So I guess I want to ask, do you have an interest in psychology? Are you someone who's been in therapy your whole life?
I have been in therapy.
Yeah.
Well, in many ways, I think that stuff came out of like when I started this book, I was single and I was dating. And I think there was a thing that I was very mindful of even as I was dating, where it was like, dating is so funny because you're at a bar with a stranger and you're literally just like telling the canned version of your life to them. And it's this thing where you just like, you meet and you're like, I'm meeting you for the first time and I now know that you love turtles. And that you like started a turtle club in the 3rd grade. And that your sister and you don't get along, but your work, it just is this thing where I'm like, in no other space in the world do you learn so much so quickly. And I think that to me really became how the book is sort of built, was that like, what is it like to sort of meet all these people and sort of tell the canned version of themselves to each other and to the reader, and to sort of be like these things that, you know, because I can only say so much, I'm sort of having to flatten things out a little bit or sort of shrink them and sort of move through life very quickly. And so what becomes the sort of the beats of someone's life, and how do you sort of present? And that was the other thing with dating too. It's like you meet someone and you're like, things are going so great, and then it would get really weird, or we would break up, or they would stop texting or ghost me or whatever. And I used to, when I was younger, I would take all of that so personally, because of course you are, because you're like, you're invested in them, and then you get hurt. But then I was like slightly older, and I was like, you just have a bunch of stuff going on. Like you have a bunch of baggage, and the way that I have a bunch of baggage, and that like you're reacting to the situation based off everything that's happened. You're reacting to this because of the Turtle Club, you know, in a way that I will never be able to understand, you know. And I just have to make peace with the fact that like your sister and your relationship is affecting this in this moment, you know, and wanting to sort of build all of that into this book. Oh yeah, that kind of so there's a lot of different styles of poly relationships in the book. And I guess my cheeky question was like, is the future poly? Well, I think it's like, well, it was this thing too where it was like, I think wanting to be, I think because, you know, it's the thing what I was saying earlier about like queer media, I think often still has this weird baggage of the like Cinderella story of being like, I was an ugly duckling, you were super hot, we're gonna get together at the end. You know, it still kind of has that structure to it. And to me, I was like, I wanted to be better about my blind spots and being like, what can I talk about that is not reflective of my own life, but is reflective of the people I know and reflective of the people that I love, and wanting to do good by the trust that I feel in those relationships with those friends, being like, I know who you are as a person, and our friendship is this space for me to know you, and I want to reflect all of the variations of that in the work that I make, you know, instead of trying to narrow it down to be maybe more palatable, or sort of narrow it down to be like what is expected in sort of like a marketable book, being like, all of these things are valid, all of these things are different approaches to being alive, and wanting to reflect that more accurately. So I think it's not that I, you know, have this idea of like what the future will be, but rather wanting to be like, there's just going to be variations on the theme forever, and wanting to really talk about that range in my life, and being very lucky, feeling very lucky that I get to know all of these people in my life who live so differently than I do, who see the world in ways that I would never be able to without them, and wanting to really, and to me feeling like that is sci-fi, you know, like that to me feels like this thing of like why I've made two big unruly sci-fi books, is that it's like this way to sort of like cast a very wide net to talk about all the things that I could possibly talk about, and really making that feel right, you know, in the world. Yes.
So continuing with the sci-fi
Yeah.
part, how much world building do you do before you start writing? It's such a rich world. How much world building do you do ahead of time versus like running into a plot thing and realizing you need background?
I feel like it's more of the latter. I feel like it's definitely sort of like working through the story as I go and sort of making it feel like there's a foundation that's sort of connecting all the dots, because I think it's something that like I sort of have umbrage with most sci-fi, is that I think it sort of builds, like it feels like you're reading a cuckoo clock instructions. Like it's like I don't necessarily always need to know like how spice is made. Like I'm sure like someone does, but like I don't care, you know. Or it's this thing where it's like, or it's like there's sort of like a weird flattening where it's like in this world all of our cell phones are crystals, and I'm like that to me doesn't feel like enough. So it's like I never want to go to either extreme. So I think I'm always sort of like using the sci-fi stuff to build in plot, and sort of using it to sort of like walk through the story as I go, and sort of making it feel like it's purposeful when it's there, rather than, because I think my habit, or sort of like, you know, making 2 400-page books, I think it would be very easy for me to sort of like really let myself spin out. And I think doing it in that way, as I was sort of like taking a walk through it, I think helps me feel like I'm going in a direction that works, that makes sense. So.
So I got, what's the time? We're going through it. We're kind of bouncing around. Sorry.
No, don't apologize.
Well, there's a, I had a thought and I lost it.
They'll come back.
There was, there's this moment in the book where Colin's character gets to see the internet for the first time. The internet no longer exists. It's post-internet, and they're viewing it in like an archived sort of way. So it's partially dead, but they're expressing wonderment not only at the like depth and variety of experiences being portrayed on the internet, but also how open people are on the internet, which is something that I feel I cannot be open on the internet. I can't even post selfies or anything. I just can't handle it. It freaks me out. But so did you, in writing that, were you taking a moment and being like, hey, this is really wonderful? Like, how do you feel about the internet right now in this moment? And then how is the internet, I have my own ideas about it, how is the internet becoming, or could, like, kind of like an Argos type technology also? Well,
I mean, I think in many ways I was like it was like that, those were genuine passages where I was really reflecting on, you know, I mean, I'm old enough that I have enough nostalgia for various versions of the internet, you know, like the live journal version of the internet. Yeah, like that stuff is still within my like knowledge as a human on this planet. And so I think it's very easy already, I think, to reflect back and feel nostalgic for those days. And I can even feel it with like the spaces I occupy now, where it's like, and I think we are always in this sort of like nostalgic back bend to be like, oh, remember when Instagram was chronological? Like, remember when Twitter didn't have like suggested tweets? Like, there's all these things that I think we're already doing as the internet sort of becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think as I get older, it feels really overwhelming to me, not because I think it's too much to handle, but rather I think a combo of like COVID lockdown and sort of like my own sort of like events in my own life the past couple of years. Like, I feel like the internet makes me feel really emotional now. Like, I was talking to my partner about this thing of like, I feel like commercials are too much for me already. Like this thing of like, and they could be over the dumbest thing, like a weird pharmaceutical thing. But like this moment, I have a sudden moment where I'm like, well, we'll be watching TV and it'll be like about like a skincare thing. And I'm like, that's a whole person. Like that person got hired to pretend that they have like a rash, and that like that is their job to like act out this rash commercial. And it's like too much for me. And I think it's this thing of like really feeling like, because that commercial is essentially like a recorded document of that person's life forever, and it's something that I just I think it is so intense to be like, this will potentially be a thing that's short-lived, that like in my 80s or something, I will reflect back on like TikTok and being like, that was amazing. This like amazing thing where I got to see like someone's cat video, you know, and that potentially won't be there forever. And how strange to be essentially like living in a burning Library of Alexandria already, where it's like all of these things, like even like Holden sends me TikToks, and there'll be TikToks that are even a week old that are deleted already. And he'll be like, I'll be like, oh, I remember when you sent me that last Tuesday, and it's gone. The link is gone. And it's just part of this like way in which we are essentially mourning something as we live it, and wanting to, you know, because I think in that passage specifically, I could have talked about like the scariness of the internet, or sort of like that the preserved passages or pages on the internet that Colin was seeing were potentially like awful. But it's like, that to me felt like, we already know, you know, we already know the awfulness. And I wanted to maybe have a moment of being like, there's so much connection that happens through the internet that I'm so grateful for, that I wanted to take a moment to talk about that.
It's also really nice. It's not something that maybe you all could think of a moment like that in other sci-fi media where I think there's moments, but they're very short. It's like oh, look at that old thing over there. Ha ha ha. It's like, like this was really like a little ode, and I'm curious to see like how that will age. You know.
I mean, there's still
nice.
like there's a moment in Cowboy Bebop. You ever seen Cowboy Bebop?
Yeah.
There's that scene where they there's an episode where they have to go get, I think they have a VHS tape, and they have to go, it's like a whole hunt, the whole episode. They have to find a workable VCR. And it was like so seared in my brain, because it was this like sci-fi story that had this very practical moment. And I don't think it was like, I don't remember what is even on the VCR, but just the fact that like there was still this awareness that in the 90s, when that show was around, that these things are temporary, and that we're just, that it's like the same as falling through our fingers as we try to hold on to it. And
I think that's that larger theme you were talking about, like being on the threshold of the door, and that's why it's so nice. Like anything that can give us pause to realize what we have right now and what's happening right now, and like this isn't forever. I'm really grateful for any media that can do that. And then the whole book I hope it's able to continue functioning like into the future, because it does have this kind of like gray fuzzy edges around it, where like the end of the book doesn't feel like you can't say whether it's optimistic or cynical. It just is. And it's going to keep going, and people are they're faced with these different situations, and they're doing the best that they can. And just within the history of the book, you imagine like things are probably going to get worse again. It's like this fluctuation. But everyone's just in the moment. It's just, and even you go so like the short while is like that's life itself. You're here for a bit.
And I think that's the thing with science fiction in general, is that I often feel like there's this sort of, it's like built, I think, into the stories themselves, where it's like, you know, there's certain tropes about like the gifted child, or sort of like the savior character, where it's like this person alone is going to fix everything, the end. And to me, it's just never been something that I've ever been drawn to telling a story like that. Like, I don't know if I could tell like a story about a school with gifted kids who then like go out and save the world. You know, like to me, it's never made sense. And I think wanting to tell sci-fi that is not, where none of the characters are the hero, like no one is there to like put on a hat and save the day and like vanquish something. You know, it's just not possible in a way that it doesn't feel possible in my own life, you know, that I don't know. And maybe that's the thing of like, maybe that's why those stories exist, because it's a kind of way to like live out that fantasy of being like, what if we had a hero? And I just am not drawn to that, you know. And I think it's something that feels
tacky.
I mean, it just feels like I'm like, I wish it could be that easy, but it just has never clicked for me.
I think it's not real.
Yeah, it just is not. Yeah.
There are moments of heroism in the book, like small, you know.
Yes, but it's always just going to be like, there was a funny moment this week where it was like the internet was doing that thing where it was like churning up an old news story, and it was like, I remember I'd forgotten that like the last Star Wars movie that had come out, there was all this talk of like Disney was going to be like, it's going to have its first gay kiss. Do you remember this? Disney was like,
I just kind of,
yeah, well, it was like Disney. They were like, Disney was like, we're gonna have our first official like gay kiss in a Star Wars movie, and everybody was like, oh my god. And then of course, like it's at the very end of the movie, and it's like two women like far in the distance, and it happens in 2 seconds. The internet was it was like a clip that was circulating where it was like the two people sort of kissing far in the background, and then it immediately cuts to a slug person, like full in the foreground, huge. And it was this thing where I was like, I'm like, I don't. It's like just not. It doesn't. That to me. I will never see myself reflected in that ever. Like, there's just no way I can ever like feel like a Jedi. I don't know. Like, what does that even mean?
What
You
if
know?
that was a
And
ratio?
it's out in foreign international markets.
Say what? Oh yeah, I'm
It
sure.
was totally
Yes.
edited.
Yeah.
Disgusting.
Not the slug person, just the kiss. We edited it out.
Okay. Well, I might have asked all of my questions.
Any questions in the audience? Any last thoughts, concerns? Or
Concerns?
yes, I saw a hand. Yes.
Yeah, I'm just like really curious because I feel like a lot of the kind of like political commentary and social commentary in the story was a lot more like kind of sharper and nuanced than I've seen in a lot of other places. It was like very satisfying to read. And I'm wondering if you did like kind of look to certain real life experiences outside of your own or like histories, even like outside the US. Where, like for example, I don't know if it was intentional, but like a lot of the parts, especially in the part that you like were showing, really reminded me of like a part of like Argentina's like history with los desaparecidos. And I was just like, oh, I don't know how much of that was intentional or it was like, you know, things go around in circles. But
Let me think. I mean, that's a really good question. I feel like in many ways, I didn't want to tell like a very specific story about a specific place. I think I was very nervous about sort of like misrepresenting or pulling too closely from anything that felt like not my story to tell. In some ways, I do think it is a cyclical thing of like these things do come around, and it's an interesting thing too of like thinking about like with science fiction. I think there is that tendency of like wanting like a hard like this is a moment, this is what's happening, these are all the players, this is what's going into it. And I've been noticing I think like for example, I just finished this week After Parties by Anthony Viana-So, and he talks a lot in it about his parents who fled the Khmer Rouge, and it was very interesting reading his stories because there was the sense that like the history that he experienced from his parents was very visceral in his childhood, but was not necessarily even his story to tell, and that the goal in those stories was really to be about this idea of like essentially trying to live life continuing on and sort of being like, how do I be the new representative of my family in this new country that we've emigrated from? And I don't know, it was something that I think seeing the way the world has gone in the past couple of years, I think there was never any place that I was like, I want to tell that story, but rather I was like, I want to speak to what this feels like. And I think the strange thing is that there is a weird universality to these sort of like traumatic world events. And I don't know, it was just something of like trying to be really specific and try to pull from places that were not my own without speaking over anybody, if that made sense. I feel like I saw another hand. Yes.
I was just gonna ask, do you have any like favorite sci-fi stories, or like what are some of the influences?
Oh my gosh, tricky. That's a tricky one.
There's a lot.
No. Well, it's yeah. I mean, I think it's a thing where it's like my love of sci-fi, there's always sort of like a little caveat next to it. So it's like I love science fiction so much, but I'm often sort of like frustrated by sort of like because even books that I love, I'm still like, they're all kind of like problematic faves. Like I was thinking earlier today, like how Ender's Game was like so formative for me, but also it's like Orson Scott Card sucks. So it's like a weird thing to be like, I owe him something, but I don't know what that would even be. the books that I'm thinking about, like I think the ones that I think about the most, like the Dispossessed, Ursula K. Le Guin, like I think that to me is such a book that I go back to mentally, because I think it is a book of like, these are just complicated things and there's no one's really doing a great job, you know, be it the capitalists or the sort of I can't remember. No one's doing a great job. And I feel like that was something that really struck with me. And I also really love Octavia Butler, and it's Parable of the Sower and Parable of the, what's the second one? Sorry, that was a bad one. Anyway, the I know I can probably
It's up there.
Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, those, what I was gonna say before I made a fool of myself by misforming the titles was that like N.K. Jemisin did an introduction. Talents, thank you. I did get that right. N.K. Jemisin did an introduction for like the newest version. I think it's that version there. And in it, she talks about sort of like this thing of like, those books are so good, but also like they have sort of these, like, they sort of age weirdly. And I think that process for her as an author, and feeling really indebted to Octavia Butler, I think has stayed with me, where it's like that thing of being like, those books have like for those who haven't read them, they're sort of told through journal entries, which the world is ending and falling apart and like people are actively dying, and yet the main character has plenty of time to like transcribe every thought they've had that day. So it's like a kind of an awkward thing. But I think that sense of feeling like this is a complicated book, I think is those are the ones that I think stay with me, because they're just someone trying to do something in a big way. And I think yeah, Ender's Game was really important to me. Octavia Butler, Ursula K. Le Guin, even in, like we talked about in our sci-fi class, there's it's not science fiction, but the fantasy books, the Legend of Earthsea. Ursula K. Le Guin talks about how the second one in that series, she did a horrible job doing, like, presenting the sort of like female character in that, and that I think has stayed with me as well. The sort of this like honesty of being like, this is a messy process, you know, and so yeah, if you haven't read any of those that I rambled off, I feel like those are all great.
I read some.
Okay.
Add the rest of it.
Okay. Any other thoughts, questions?
All right. Okay. We do have books for sale if you are interested in purchasing one. They're on the counter. Leave the chairs, I'll pick those up, but visit with our author and hang out.
I couldn't remember.
Goodbye, people in cyber.